Some mysteries become famous because they're complicated. The JonBenét Ramsey case became famous because it feels impossible. A 6-year-old child is reported missing from her own home on Christmas night. A ransom note is found. Police arrive. Friends and neighbors gather. Hours pass. And then, in a moment that would permanently alter the case, JonBenét is found inside the house. From that point forward, the story became a collision of evidence, mistakes, media spectacle, and competing theories, so intense that decades later, people still ask the same question. How can a case this high profile remain unsolved? This documentary is a careful breakdown of the known timeline, the major evidence, and the leading categories of theories, presented responsibly, without accusing uncharged private individuals as fact. This video discusses the death of a child. We will avoid graphic descriptions and focus on the investigation, evidence categories, and systemic issues that contributed to the case remaining unresolved. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old, living with her family in Boulder, Colorado. She was known publicly for child pageants, which later became a major point of cultural debate. But the pageant element can distract from what matters most. She was a child, a daughter, a person with a life beyond public images. When children become symbols, the world argues over narratives. When children are victims, the world owes them truth. On December 25th, the Ramsey family spent Christmas Day with events typical of a holiday. In the early hours of December 26th, JonBenét was reported missing. A ransom note was discovered inside the home. The police were called. Officers arrived to find a distressed household, a ransom note indicating kidnapping, friends and neighbors present in the home. From an investigative standpoint, this scene created immediate complications. A crime scene requires control, but the home environment quickly became populated. This would later be seen as one of the early factors that complicated forensic clarity. The ransom note is among the most analyzed pieces of evidence in modern true crime. Not because ransom notes are rare, but because this one was unusually long and detailed. It shaped everything that followed: how police interpreted the case initially, how the family behaved under pressure, how media framed the story, how theories developed. Investigators debated whether the note was authentic kidnapping communication, whether it was staged, whether the language suggested familiarity with the home or family. The ransom note became a psychological battlefield where every phrase was examined for intent. But language analysis is not the same as proof. It can suggest, but rarely confirms. As the morning continued, police and those present searched areas of the home. JonBenét was ultimately found inside the house. That discovery changed the case instantly. It was no longer a kidnapping, it was now a homicide investigation. And because the home contained many people, the case faced immediate questions about contamination, missed evidence, and early decisions that could not be undone. This case exploded for several reasons. The victim was a child. The family was wealthy and prominent locally. Pageant photos were widely circulated. The ransom note created sensational headlines. The home setting fueled suspicion and speculation. Media attention became so intense that it arguably influenced public perception more than the evidence did. And when public perception hardens early, it can distort the space investigators need to work. To understand why the JonBenét Ramsey case became so difficult to solve, you have to understand what happened in the earliest hours. When police first arrived, they treated the situation like a kidnapping because a ransom note had been found and JonBenét was not located. But in that early phase, the home contained multiple people: friends, family, and officers moving through rooms, touching surfaces, opening doors, and searching spaces. This is not a moral judgment. It's an investigative reality. A homicide case relies on preserving evidence, controlling access, and minimizing contamination. In this case, the scene was not sealed in a way that modern protocols would demand. And when you lose the purity of a scene, you don't just lose evidence, you lose certainty. You lose the ability to say with confidence what belongs to the crime and what belongs to later movement. That's one of the reasons this case became a puzzle that evidence alone could not easily solve. The ransom note remains one of the most unusual aspects of the case. Even now, it is debated for several reasons. 1. Length and detail. It was unusually long compared to most ransom notes. That detail made investigators ask whether it was written under pressure, staged, or created by someone with time inside the home. 2. Location and opportunity. The note being found in the home raised questions about whether it was written there or brought in. 3. Tone and language. The note's tone and word choices were heavily analyzed. Some believed it sounded theatrical, others believed it could be imitation or an attempt to misdirect. 4. Handwriting analysis. Handwriting analysis became a major pillar of public debate. But handwriting analysis is not a perfect science. Even when experts disagree, their disagreement does not equal proof. And that's the key point. The ransom note is powerful because it feels like it should unlock the case. But it may also be the thing that trapped the case in endless argument. In a case where physical evidence became contested, language became a battleground. The public often assumes that forensic evidence is definitive, like a fingerprint in a movie. Real investigations aren't like that. They are built from partial evidence, probability, context, and interpretation. In this case, several categories of evidence were debated. A. DNA evidence became central to the case's long-term controversy. Over the years, reporting and investigative summaries discussed the presence of DNA that was not immediately matched to a known person. This created one of the biggest divides. Some argued DNA supports an intruder theory. Others argued trace DNA can be transferred in non-criminal ways and is not always definitive. In modern forensic discussion, touch DNA and mixed profiles can exist without proving who committed a crime. This is why the DNA did not automatically resolve the case. It raised questions, but did not conclusively answer them. B. Fibers and trace evidence. Fibers and trace evidence were also discussed in public reporting, items that can suggest contact but often cannot specify exactly when or how that contact occurred. Trace evidence is especially vulnerable in a home environment because people live there, clothing and blankets move, and contamination can occur during search and discovery. C. Timing challenges. A fundamental issue was time. When a crime scene isn't controlled early, it becomes harder to pinpoint what happened when and which evidence belongs to which moment. And in this case, time was the enemy. Uncertainty grew with each hour that passed inside an active household with multiple people present. Because this case remains unsolved, many theories exist. To discuss them responsibly, it helps to organize them into categories. I'm going to describe the main theory buckets people discuss without presenting any single theory as proven. Bucket 1. Intruder theory. This theory suggests that someone outside the family entered the home and committed the crime. Those who support this bucket often point to unidentified DNA discussions, the idea that a ransom note resembles kidnapping staging, the possibility of an unknown offender. Critics of this bucket argue an intruder would have needed time and access. The ransom note's length and tone feel inconsistent with a quick criminal entry. Evidence ambiguity makes it hard to prove beyond possibility. Bucket 2. Inside the home involvement. This bucket suggests that someone within the household may have been involved directly or indirectly, and that staging could have occurred after the fact. This bucket has been heavily argued for decades because the crime happened inside the home and because of the unusual ransom note, the scene complexity, early investigative focus. But it is important to state, public suspicion is not proof, and accusations against private individuals must be handled carefully. Bucket 3. Accidental event leading to cover-up. This bucket is a variation that suggests an unplanned event occurred and that later actions were taken to protect someone, creating confusion in evidence. People argue this bucket because it can explain contradictory elements, it fits the idea of panic and staging, and it explains why the case appears simultaneously personal and theatrical. Critics argue it is too speculative. It relies heavily on psychological interpretation rather than evidence, and it can become a narrative people gravitate toward because it feels plausible. Here is the responsible truth. These theory buckets exist because the evidence never became clean enough to collapse the possibilities into one definitive story. In almost every unsolved case, the first day matters more than people realize. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, controversies centered on whether the home was treated as a controlled crime scene early enough, whether key interviews happened quickly enough, whether the investigation became too influenced by public pressure, whether focus narrowed too quickly, too broadly, or shifted inconsistently. Another major factor was the intense media storm. When media attention explodes, investigators face pressure to produce suspects, deliver answers, and manage public opinion. But criminal investigations are not designed for public satisfaction. They are designed for courtroom proof. This case became one of the most public investigations in America, and that visibility created a second problem. Witnesses and narratives become contaminated not only by scene movement, but by media coverage. When everyone sees the same headlines, people's memories reshape. Stories harden. Speculation becomes common knowledge, and then common knowledge begins to replace careful evidence. Now let's answer the main question with clarity. Why was the case never solved? 1. Evidence ambiguity. The forensic evidence did not create a single undeniable path to one suspect. Instead, it created multiple possibilities with no final lock. 2. Early scene contamination. A scene that is not tightly controlled early becomes a scene full of uncertainty. That uncertainty becomes a defense argument in court, and prosecutors often avoid cases they fear cannot meet the burden of proof. 3. Narrative overload. Because the case became a cultural obsession, theories multiplied faster than evidence could eliminate them. 4. Time. As years pass, memories fade, witnesses disappear, physical evidence degrades, and investigative momentum slows. 5. The burden of proof. Even if investigators strongly suspect a theory, suspicion is not enough for conviction. A prosecutor must believe they can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, too many contradictions and uncertainties remained. Even decades later, JonBenét Ramsey's case remains a cultural symbol of investigative failure and complexity, media influence, the limits of forensic certainty, and the way public narratives can harden without resolution. It also remains a reminder of the human element. JonBenét was not a storyline, she was a child, and unresolved cases are heavy because they keep grief open, not just for family, but for everyone who cares about justice. There are responsible lessons here. 1. Early crime scene control is everything. The first hours can decide the next decades. 2. Media storms can distort justice. Public obsession does not equal progress. 3. Forensic evidence is powerful, but not magical. DNA and trace evidence require context and clean handling. 4. Multiple theories can coexist when evidence is weak. When the case doesn't lock, people fill the gap with story. 5. Remember the victim as a person. The case is famous, but fame is not the point. Truth is. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains unsolved, not because people stopped caring, but because the case became too complex too early, and the evidence never achieved the clarity required for a single, courtroom-ready conclusion. Decades later, the questions remain. And behind those questions is a child whose life mattered far beyond an investigation, beyond headlines, beyond theories. If this video does anything, let it push the conversation away from spectacle and back toward the realities that matter: evidence, accountability, and respect. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more.